The thunderclap that shook the small homestead outside Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, was nothing compared to the storm brewing in Emma O'Connor's heart. Her delicate fingers trembled as she set the second plate on the worn oak table, the blue-bordered china a stark contrast to the rough-hewn wood. It was 1877, and the promises of a new life on the frontier had withered like the maize in that summer's drought. Emma had spent the morning preparing Hank's favorite meal venison stew with dumplings and fresh-picked blackberries, but Hank would never come home to enjoy it. 3 days ago, a neighbor had ridden in with the news. Her husband of just 1 year had been killed in a mining accident, crushed beneath tons of rock and earth while pursuing the silver dreams that had brought them west. She stared at the empty chair across from her, tears flowing freely down her pale cheeks. The stew bubbled in the pot hanging over the fire, filling the cabin with a hearty aroma that now seemed to mock her solitude. Outside, rain began to patter against the roof, matching the rhythm of her falling tears. A sudden knock at the door startled her. Emma quickly wiped her face with her apron, though there was little point in hiding her grief. Everyone in the small settlement knew of her tragedy. Mrs. O'Connor. The deep voice called through the door. "It's Frank Zimmerman. I've brought your supplies from town." Emma hesitated before crossing the room to open the door. Frank Zimmerman was one of the cowboys from the Circle Z ranch that bordered her small homestead. She had seen him in town occasionally, tipping his hat politely as they passed on the dusty streets. He was known as a quiet man, strong and capable, who kept mostly to himself despite his reputation as one of the finest horsemen in the territory. "Good day, Mr. Zimmerman," she said, opening the door just enough to see him. He stood on her porch, rain dripping from the brim of his weather-worn hat. His tall frame was wrapped in a heavy duster, and beside him sat 2 crates of supplies. "Mrs. O'Connor," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Mr. Fleming at the general store asked if I'd deliver these, seeing as I was headed this way." His eyes, a clear gray beneath dark brows, took in her tear-stained face but didn't linger there. "I can just leave them here on the porch if you'd prefer." "No, please, bring them in out of the rain," she said, stepping back to allow him entry. "It's kind of you to make the detour." Frank carried the crates inside, setting them carefully by the pantry door. He straightened up, removing his hat and holding it in his weathered hands. Water dripped onto the plank floor from his duster as his gaze fell upon the table with its 2-place settings. Emma followed his gaze and fresh tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, turning away. "I still can't believe he's gone. I keep setting his place out of habit." Frank remained silent for a long moment, his presence solid and undemanding in the small cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "Eat," he said simply, gesturing toward the table. "He'd want you to." The unexpected kindness in those few words broke something loose inside Emma. A sob escaped her throat, and she pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle it. Frank shifted uncomfortably but didn't retreat. "I lost my brother 2 years back," he said, his voice low. "Found myself talking to him at supper for months after. Grief has its own time, Mrs. O'Connor." Emma nodded, unable to speak. The cowboy's candid admission touched her. She'd seen Frank Zimmerman around town for the 3 years she and Hank had lived in Willow Creek, but they'd never exchanged more than polite greetings. "The stew smells mighty fine," Frank continued, his eyes moving to the pot over the fire. "Be ashamed to let it go to waste." Emma wiped her eyes. "There's more than enough," she said hesitantly. Would you care to join me, Mr. Zimmerman? It seems wrong to eat alone, and I can't bear to sit at that table by myself." Frank's expression registered surprise before settling into something softer. "I'd be honored, madam, but only if you'll call me Frank. Mr. Zimmerman was my father." "Then you must call me Emma," she replied, managing a small smile. "Please hang your coat by the door to dry." As Frank removed his duster, Emma busied herself serving the stew into bowls. The familiar routine of hospitality gave her hands something to do besides shake. She'd been alone for 3 days, and the silence had been deafening. Even the company of a near stranger seemed preferable to another meal with only her grief for company. "This is mighty kind of you," Frank said as he took the seat across from Hank's place. He waited until Emma was seated before picking up his spoon, "It's nothing special," she said, watching as he tasted the stew. "Best I've had in a long while," he replied with genuine appreciation. "Been living on cookies grub at the ranch, and while he tries his best, he has a heavy hand with the salt and not much else to recommend his cooking." A small laugh escaped Emma's lips before she could stop it, and the sound surprised her as much as it seemed to please Frank. His smile transformed his weather-roughened face, making him appear younger than his 30 years. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the rain providing a gentle backdrop to their meal. Emma found herself studying the cowboy surreptitiously. His hands were strong and calloused, but he handled the delicate china with care. His face was tanned from long days under the Arizona sun, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes despite his generally serious demeanor. "How long have you worked at the Circle Z?" Emma asked finally. 5 years this September," Frank replied. "Came west from Missouri after the war, needed open skies after all that." Emma nodded. "Hank felt the same. We married in Illinois, but he couldn't settle, said he felt the walls closing in." She paused, her throat tightening. "I sometimes wonder if we'd stayed east, would he?" "Can't live on what-ifs, Emma," Frank said gently. "A man makes his choices, follows his heart. Hank chose this life, chose you. There's honor in that, even if it ended too soon." His words, simple but profound, offered more comfort than all the platitudes she'd received since Hank's death. Emma reached for her glass of water to hide the fresh wave of emotion. "What will you do now?" Frank asked after a moment. Emma sighed, setting down her spoon. "I don't know. I have no family left back east. Hank's parents passed before we married." She gestured around the modest cabin. "This land is mine, but I don't know if I can work it alone. We had such plans." "The West demands much from those who choose it," Frank said, "but it gives much in return." "There's a strength in you, Emma. I can see it." "I don't feel very strong right now," she admitted. "Strength isn't about not feeling pain," Frank replied. "It's about continuing despite it." Outside, the rain began to ease. A shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, sending a golden beam through the window to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air between them. "I should be going," Frank said, rising from his chair. "The ranch hands will be wondering where I've gotten to." "Thank you for the company," Emma said, standing as well. "And for bringing the supplies. I wasn't looking forward to going into town just yet." Frank nodded, reaching for his hat. "If you need anything firewood chopped, repairs, you just send word to the Circle Z. The boys and I would be happy to help." Emma walked him to the door where his duster had mostly dried. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition among neighbors," Frank said firmly. "Out here, we look after each other. Hank would have done the same for any of us." As he stepped onto the porch, Frank turned back. "That was a fine meal, Emma. Thank you for sharing it." "Thank you for reminding me to eat it," she replied with a small smile. With a tip of his hat, Frank descended the steps and untied his horse from the hitching post. The animal, a magnificent chestnut gelding, whickered softly as Frank swung into the saddle with effortless grace. Emma stood in the doorway watching as horse and rider disappeared down the trail that led toward the Circle Z, the sun now breaking fully through the clouds to cast long shadows across the land. For the first time in 3 days, she felt something other than grief, a tiny spark of resilience, a whispered reminder that life continued, even when it seemed impossible. She turned back to the table with its two-place settings, but instead of tears, she felt a strange peace. "You'd have liked him, Hank," she said softly to the empty chair. Then she began to clear the dishes, saving Frank's bowl for last. As days turned into weeks, Emma found herself settling into a new routine. The grief remained, a constant companion, but it no longer overwhelmed her every waking moment. She tended her small vegetable garden, cared for the few chickens, and the milk cow Hank had bought just before his death, and began to mend the fences that had suffered from neglect during her darkest days. True to his word, Frank Zimmerman stopped by occasionally, always with some practical reason, delivering mail that had come for her to the ranch, bringing fresh game from a hunting trip, or simply checking that she had enough firewood as the summer heat began to give way to cooler autumn temperatures. Each visit was brief, but left Emma feeling less alone in the world. One crisp September morning, Emma was attempting to repair the roof of her chicken coop when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. Frank rode into the yard, leading a second horse laden with lumber. "Morning, Emma," he called, dismounting with fluid ease. "Thought you might need some help with repairs before winter sets in." Emma climbed down from her precarious perch, brushing wood shavings from her apron. "Frank, I wasn't expecting you today." "Had some time off from the ranch," he explained, removing his hat briefly to wipe his brow. "Mr. Circle, that is, Mr. Zachary gave me a couple days to see to my own affairs." He gestured toward the chicken coop. "That roof won't hold through a decent rain, much less a snow." Emma sighed, looking at her handiwork. "I know. I'm afraid carpentry wasn't among the skills my father thought a daughter should learn." Frank's mouth quirked in a small smile. "Well, it was among the skills my father insisted a son should master. Let me have a look." For the rest of the day, they worked side by side, Frank patiently showing Emma how to measure and cut the lumber, how to hammer nails without striking her thumb, and how to judge if a joint was sound. By the time the sun began to set, the chicken coop boasted a sturdy new roof, and Emma had gained confidence in her ability to maintain her homestead. "You're a quick study," Frank commented as they put the tools away in the small shed. "I had a good teacher," Emma replied with a smile. She hesitated, then added, "Would you stay for supper?" "I've got a rabbit stew that's been simmering all day." Frank's gray eyes warmed. "I'd be obliged." Over the meal, their conversation flowed more easily than before. Emma told him about growing up in Illinois, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had instilled in her a love of books and learning. Frank spoke of his childhood in Missouri, the middle son of a blacksmith who had expected all three of his boys to follow in his footsteps. "But you became a cowboy instead," Emma observed. Frank nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "The war changed things. My older brother didn't come home. My younger brother, James, was the one who died 2 years back. Influenza took him in the winter of '75. I came west after Appomattox, couldn't face the smithy without Thomas beside me." He looked down at his hands. "My father never forgave me for leaving." "I'm sorry," Emma said softly. "About your brothers and your father." Frank's shoulders lifted in a small shrug. "Life goes on. You find new purpose." He glanced up at her. "That's what you're doing now, finding your way forward. Some days are easier than others," Emma admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and for just a moment I forget that Hank is gone, then it all comes rushing back." "That will happen less as time passes," Frank said gently. "Not that you'll forget him, you never will, but the pain becomes manageable." They finished the meal in contemplative silence, each lost in memories. As Frank prepared to leave, the night air had grown cool, and Emma impulsively offered him a knitted scarf that had been Hank's. "Winter's coming," she said. "And Hank would want it to be useful rather than sitting in a drawer." Frank accepted the gift with a solemn nod, wrapping it around his neck. "I'll think of both of you when I wear it," he said. As autumn deepened, Frank's visits became more regular. He always brought some small gift, a book from the ranch library, seeds for spring planting, or news from town, and never stayed longer than propriety allowed. Emma found herself looking forward to these visits, planning meals that might tempt him to linger and storing up stories to share. By November, when the first snow dusted the hills around Willow Creek, Emma realized that her feelings for the quiet cowboy had grown into something more than friendship. The realization frightened her. It felt like a betrayal of Hank's memory. Even as she acknowledged that her heart had begun to heal, on Thanksgiving Day, a knock at her door revealed Frank standing on her porch, holding a wild turkey. "Thought you might be able to use this," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "No one should be alone today." Emma invited him in, touched by the gesture. As they prepared the meal together, she found herself watching him move around her kitchen, his presence filling the small space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. "I've been thinking," Frank said as they sat down to eat at the table that now seemed naturally set for two. "The Circle Z needs a schoolteacher." Emma looked up in surprise. "A schoolteacher?" Frank nodded, his expression earnest. "There are 8 children at the ranch now, Han's kids and Mr. Zachary's 3. They're running wild with no proper learning. Mr. Zachary mentioned just last week that he's been considering hiring someone to teach them. And you thought of me, Emma said slowly. You mentioned your father was a teacher, Frank replied, and I've seen all those books you keep. Thought it might suit you better than struggling with this place alone through the winter. Emma considered the offer. The homestead was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the weather worsened. The prospect of regular work, of being around children and books again, was appealing. Would I live at the ranch? She asked. There's a small cabin that could be fixed up, Frank said. Or you could ride over daily when the weather's fair. It's your choice, Emma. The way he said her name with such care and respect made her heart skip. I'll think about it, she promised. 2 days later, Emma rode to the Circle Z ranch to speak with Mr. Zachary. The ranch house was an impressive 2-story structure, surrounded by barns, bunkhouses, and corrals that housed some of the finest cattle and horses in the territory. Mr. Zachary, a broad-shouldered man with a generous mustache, welcomed her warmly. Frank speaks highly of your abilities, Mrs. O'Connor, he said as they sat in his study. We can offer you room and board plus $20 a month to start. The teaching would be 5 days a week, with basic subjects for the younger ones and more advanced lessons for the older children. That's very generous, Emma replied. When would you want me to start? After Christmas would be fine, Mr. Zachary said. Give you time to settle your affairs at your homestead. As Emma rode home, her mind was made up. Teaching at the Circle Z would give her purpose again, as well as practical support through the difficult winter months. If her decision was influenced by the prospect of seeing Frank Zimmerman more regularly, she didn't allow herself to dwell on it. December brought heavy snows that isolated the homestead for days at a time. Emma used the solitude to prepare for her new role, organizing lesson plans and packing her most treasured possessions. She had decided to keep the homestead but live at the ranch during the school term. It felt like the right balance, honoring Hank's dream while pursuing her own future. On Christmas Eve, Emma was surprised by another visit from Frank, despite the snow-covered trails. He arrived bearing a small pine tree strapped to his saddle and a burlap sack of simple decorations. Thought you might want some Christmas cheer, he said, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. Together they set up the tree in a corner of the cabin and decorated it with the paper stars, pine cones, and ribbons Frank had brought. The simple activity filled the small home with laughter and light that had been absent for too long. As twilight fell, they sat before the fire, mugs of hot cider warming their hands. Frank seemed unusually pensive, staring into the flames. Is something troubling you? Emma asked gently. Frank looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. I've been thinking about propriety, he said slowly. Emma felt her cheeks warm, though whether from the fire or his words she couldn't tell. Propriety. You'll be living at the ranch soon, Frank continued. Working for the same outfit as me, people might talk. About what? Emma asked, though she suspected she knew. Frank set down his mug and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. About how often I seek out your company, about how my eyes follow you when you're near. He paused, his gaze direct and honest. About how I've come to care for you, Emma. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. Frank, I know it's too soon, he said quickly. I know you're still grieving Hank. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that my intentions are honorable, and if someday you might consider. He trailed off, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Emma set her own mug aside and reached out to touch his hand. I've come to care for you too, Frank. More than I thought possible after losing Hank. She took a steadying breath. But you're right, it is soon. I need time. Frank turned his hand to clasp hers, his touch warm and reassuring. Time is something I can give, he said softly. I'm not going anywhere, Emma. The moment hung between them, full of possibility and promise. Then Frank gently released her hand and stood. I should get back to the ranch before it gets any darker. Emma walked him to the door, where he paused to don his hat and scarf Hank's scarf, she noted with a bittersweet pang. Merry Christmas, Emma, he said. Merry Christmas, Frank, she replied. On impulse, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his weathered cheek. The smile that bloomed on Frank's face warmed her through the coldest night of the year. Emma began her teaching duties at the Circle Z Ranch in January 1878. The small cabin Frank had mentioned had been transformed into a one-room schoolhouse, complete with a blackboard, desks fashioned by the ranch carpenter, and a small stove to ward off the winter chill. The 8 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, regarded their new teacher with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that soon gave way to respect, as Emma demonstrated both kindness and firm expectations. Living at the ranch changed the rhythm of Emma's days completely. She took her meals in the main house with the Zachary family, spent her days in the schoolroom, and occupied a small but comfortable room in the east wing of the ranch house. She saw Frank daily, though always in the company of others at mealtimes, during Sunday services in the ranch's common room, or when he occasionally helped one of the older boys with riding lessons after school. Their interactions were friendly but restrained, respecting both Emma's need for time and the watchful eyes of the ranch community. Still, Emma couldn't help noticing how Frank always made sure her coffee cup was filled at breakfast, or how he seemed to know when she needed help carrying books or supplies to the schoolhouse. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Emma fell into a comfortable routine at the Circle Z. Every other Saturday, weather permitting, she rode back to her homestead to check on things, often accompanied by Frank or one of the ranch hands for safety. On one such trip in early April, she was surprised to find her vegetable garden had been tilled and prepared for planting. "Did you do this?" she asked Frank, who had escorted her that day. He nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Thought you might want to plant some things that would be ready for harvest come summer." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Emma deeply. Together, they spent the afternoon planting seeds, corn, beans, tomatoes, and squash in the freshly turned earth. As they worked side by side under the warming sun, Emma found herself studying Frank's profile when he wasn't looking, admiring the strong lines of his jaw and the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "You're staring, Mrs. O'Connor," Frank said without looking up from the row of beans he was planting, a smile evident in his voice. Emma blushed, caught in her observation. "I was just thinking how different you look outside the ranch setting," she said, which wasn't entirely untrue. Here, away from his duties, Frank seemed more relaxed, more open. "Different good or different bad?" he asked, glancing up at her with a teasing light in his gray eyes. "Different good," Emma admitted. "You seem more yourself." Frank sat back on his heels, wiping his brow with his shirt sleeve. "That's because I am. At the ranch, I'm Mr. Zimmerman, trusted foreman. Here, I'm just Frank." "I like just Frank," Emma said softly. He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Good," he said simply, and returned to his planting. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in Emma's cabin before riding back to the ranch, Frank broached a subject that had been on his mind. "The spring dance is coming up in 2 weeks," he said, referring to the social event that the town of Willow Creek held annually. "Would you consider attending with me?" Emma looked up from her plate, surprised. As my companion for the evening," Frank clarified quickly. "No obligations, no expectations, just 2 friends enjoying some music and company." Emma considered the invitation. The spring dance would be her first major social event since Hank's death. People would talk, as they always did in small communities. But she found she didn't mind the prospect as much as she might have a few months ago. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Thank you for asking." Frank's face lit up with pleasure. "I'll make sure your name is on the sign-up for the ladies' refreshment table. I recall you mentioned once that your apple pie was the talk of your church socials back in Illinois." The fact that he remembered such a small detail from one of their conversations warmed Emma's heart. "My mother's recipe," she acknowledged. "I'll need to visit my homestead again before the dance to gather the dried apples from the cellar." "Just say when," Frank replied. The night of the spring dance arrived clear and mild, with a crescent moon hanging low in the sky. Emma stood before the small mirror in her room at the ranch house, adjusting the collar of her best dress, a deep blue cotton with tiny white flowers embroidered along the neckline. She had taken extra care with her appearance, pinning her light brown hair in a simple but elegant style and adding a touch of rose water behind her ears. A knock at her door announced Mrs. Zachary, the ranch owner's wife, who had become something of a friend in the month since Emma had come to teach. "You look lovely, Emma," she said warmly. "That color suits you beautifully." "Thank you," Emma replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. "It's been so long since I attended any social function." Mrs. Zachary's eyes softened with understanding. "The first time is always the hardest, but you won't be alone. Frank will be with you, and heaven knows that man has eyes for no one else when you're in the room." Emma felt her cheeks warm. "We're just friends," she said automatically. Mrs. Zachary raised an eyebrow but didn't contradict her. "Well, friend or otherwise, he's waiting in the front parlor, looking as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs." The image made Emma laugh, easing some of her tension. She gathered her shawl and the carefully packed basket containing her apple pie, then followed Mrs. Zachary downstairs. Frank stood by the fireplace, dressed in his Sunday best, a clean dark shirt, a newly pressed vest, and trousers that had clearly been carefully brushed. His hair was neatly combed and he had trimmed his beard. When he turned and saw Emma, his expression of admiration was so transparent that Emma felt her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Emma replied. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Zimmerman." Their journey to town was filled with easy conversation about the children's progress in school, the new foals born at the ranch, and speculation about who might win the cake walk at the dance. By the time they arrived at the town hall, Emma's nervousness had largely dissipated, replaced by a pleasant anticipation. The hall was decorated with spring flowers and ribbons, with lanterns casting a warm glow over the assembled townspeople. A small band played in one corner, and several couples were already moving around the cleared space in the center of the room. Emma delivered her pie to the refreshment table, where she was warmly greeted by the other ladies from town. There were a few curious glances at Frank, who stood patiently waiting nearby, but no one made any inappropriate comments about their arrival together. "Mrs. O'Connor," a deep voice said, and Emma turned to find Sheriff Parker, a gruff but fair-minded man who had been kind during the aftermath of Hank's death. "It's good to see you here. You've been missed in town." "Thank you, Sheriff," Emma replied. "It's good to be back." "I hear you're teaching out at the Circle Z now," he continued. "Those youngsters are lucky to have you." They chatted for a few moments before the sheriff moved on to greet other arrivals. Frank stepped forward, offering Emma a cup of punch. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded, touched by his concern. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "It's nice to see familiar faces again." The evening progressed pleasantly, with Emma dividing her time between helping at the refreshment table and dancing with various partners, including Mr. Zachary, the town mayor, and even young Tommy Fletcher, the 13-year-old son of the local blacksmith who blushed furiously through the entire reel. Finally, as the band struck up a waltz, Frank approached her. "May I have this dance, Emma?" he asked, extending his hand. Emma placed her hand in his, feeling a flutter of anticipation as his fingers closed gently around hers. "You may," she replied. Frank led her onto the dance floor, placing his other hand respectfully at her waist as they began to move to the music. Emma had expected him to be a competent dancer, but she was surprised by the grace with which he guided her through the steps. "You dance very well," she commented. A smile touched his lips. "My mother insisted all her sons learn, said no girl would marry a man who stepped on her toes at socials." "Wise woman," Emma said, returning his smile. As they circled the floor, Emma became increasingly aware of Frank's nearness, the solid warmth of his hand at her waist, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him, the way his eyes never left her face. For the first time since Hank's death, she felt fully alive, her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with possibility. The waltz ended too soon, and they reluctantly separated as the band announced the cakewalk would begin. Standing at the edge of the dance floor, Frank kept his hand lightly on the small of Emma's back, a gesture that was both protective and possessive in the most gentlemanly way. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Emma looked up at him, struck by the openness in his expression. "So am I," she replied honestly. Later, as they drove back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Emma found herself relaxed and content, leaning slightly against Frank's solid presence on the wagon seat. They talked of small things, how her pie had been the first to disappear from the refreshment table, how Mr. Fletcher had fallen asleep during the mayor's speech, how the youngest Zachary boy had managed to spill punch on the sheriff's boots. When they reached the ranch house, Frank helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. By unspoken agreement, they walked not toward the main house but to the small garden behind the kitchen, where a bench sat beneath an old cottonwood tree. "I have something for you," Frank said as they sat down. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Emma asked, surprised. "Open it," he urged. Emma carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a beautifully carved wooden rose, its petals so delicate they looked almost real, its stem curved gracefully. "Frank, it's beautiful," she breathed, turning the carving to admire it from all angles. "Did you make this?" He nodded, a pleased expression crossing his face. "Been working on it for a while, wanted to get it right." "I didn't know you carved," Emma said, touched by the gift and the thought behind it. "My father taught me before." He trailed off, then continued. "Haven't done much of it since coming west. This is the first piece I've finished in years." Emma understood the significance of the gesture, that he had returned to something from his past, something connected to his family, to create something for her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." Frank reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her free hand in his. "Emma," he said, his voice deep and earnest, "I know it's only been 7 months since Hank passed, and I respect that you're still healing. But I want you to know that my feelings for you have only grown stronger." Emma looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his sun-darkened skin and her paler complexion. "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to honor Hank's memory," she said carefully. "At first, I thought it meant holding on to grief, as if letting go would somehow diminish what we had." She raised her eyes to meet Frank's steady gaze. "But lately, I've come to believe that the best way to honor him is to live fully, to embrace happiness when it's offered. Hank would never have wanted me to spend my life alone and mourning." Frank's hand tightened slightly around hers. "What are you saying, Emma?" "I'm saying that I care for you, Frank Zimmerman," Emma said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "More than I thought possible, and in a way that no longer feels like a betrayal of my past but a gift for my future." The smile that spread across Frank's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to reconsider, he leaned forward. Emma met him halfway, her eyes closing as their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally parted, Frank rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "I'll court you proper, Emma O'Connor," he whispered, "if you'll let me." Emma smiled, her heart fuller than she had believed possible just a few months ago. "I'd like that very much," she replied. Spring blossomed into summer, and Frank courted Emma with a respectful devotion that won the approval of even the most gossipy townsfolk. They rode together on Sunday afternoons, picnicked by the creek that gave Willow Creek its name, and spent pleasant evenings on the ranch house porch, sometimes in conversation, sometimes simply enjoying the companionable silence between them. Emma continued to teach, finding fulfillment in watching her students grow in knowledge and confidence. She maintained her homestead as well, visiting regularly with Frank to tend the garden and make small improvements to the cabin. It remained a place of memories, but increasingly it also became a place of new beginnings, as she and Frank planted fruit trees that would take years to bear and discussed possibilities for expanding the small structure. By August, when the summer heat lay heavy over the land and the children enjoyed their break from schooling, Frank and Emma had settled into a relationship that felt both comfortable and exciting. Their courtship progressed naturally, with each discovery about the other deepening their connection. Emma learned that Frank had a dry wit that emerged when he was truly at ease, that he could recite Shakespeare from memory, a result of his mother's insistence on education, and that he dreamed of someday having his own small ranch where he could raise horses. Frank discovered Emma's passion for botany, her unexpected skill at checkers, and her inability to abide licorice in any form. He treasured each new revelation, storing them away like the precious gifts they were. One evening in late August, they sat on the porch of Emma's homestead after a day spent canning preserves from the garden's bounty. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and rose. "I've been thinking," Frank said, breaking a comfortable silence. Emma turned to look at him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "A dangerous pastime," he chuckled. "Indeed." His expression grew more serious as he took her hand. "I've been thinking about the future." "Our future, if you're willing." Emma's heart quickened. "Go on," she encouraged softly. Frank shifted to face her more directly. "I love you, Emma. I think I've loved you since that first day I found you crying over 2 plates set for dinner. You were so broken, yet so strong in your brokenness." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of grief. "I love you too, Frank." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know this place holds memories of Hank, and I would never ask you to let those go, but I was wondering if you might consider making new memories here, with me." "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I am," he said, opening the pouch to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set in its center. "Emma O'Connor, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Emma looked at the ring, then at the earnest face of the man she had come to love so deeply. In that moment, she felt Hank's presence not as a ghost from the past, but as a blessing for her future. He would have approved of Frank. She knew of his integrity, his kindness, his steadfastness. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Frank Zimmerman." Frank's face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise that words could not contain. They were married on the first day of October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned to gold and the air held the first crispness of autumn. The ceremony took place at Emma's homestead, now their homestead, with the entire community of the Circle Z Ranch and most of Willow Creek in attendance. Emma wore a new dress of deep ivory with lace at the collar and cuffs, her hair adorned with small white flowers. Frank, looking both nervous and prouder than anyone had ever seen him, wore a new suit ordered specially from Denver for the occasion. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with Mr. Zachary standing as Frank's best man and Mrs. Zachary as Emma's matron of honor. The local minister spoke of new beginnings and the courage it takes to open one's heart after loss, his words bringing tears to many eyes in the gathering. As they exchanged vows, Emma felt a profound sense of rightness, as if her life had come full circle from that day of devastating grief to this moment of transcendent joy. When Frank placed a second ring on her finger to join her engagement band, his hands were steady and sure, just like his promise to love and cherish her all the days of their lives. The celebration afterward was joyous, with tables set up in the yard beneath strings of lanterns, music provided by the same band that had played at the spring dance, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. As twilight fell, Frank led Emma in their first dance as husband and wife, moving with the same grace that had surprised her months before. "Happy, Mrs. Zimmerman," he murmured against her ear. "More than I ever thought possible again," she replied, leaning into his embrace. Later, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone, Frank carried Emma across the threshold of the cabin that would be their home. Inside, he had made subtle changes in preparation for their married life: a larger bed with a new quilt, a rocking chair by the fire, a bookshelf filled with volumes from his own collection as well as hers. On the table, which now seemed meant for two, stood a small vase containing a single rose, not a carved wooden one, but a real late-blooming flower from Mrs. Zachary's garden. "For new beginnings," Frank said, following her gaze to the rose. "And for honoring what came before," Emma added, thinking of that day when a kind cowboy had told a grieving widow to eat because her husband would have wanted it. How far they had come from that moment of shared humanity to this night of shared love. Frank drew her into his arms, his kiss tender and reverent. "I will spend every day trying to deserve the gift of your heart," he promised. "You already do," Emma assured him, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "You always have." The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to Frank and Emma Zimmerman. They continued to live on the homestead, with Frank riding to the Circle Z daily for his work, while Emma split her time between teaching at the ranch schoolhouse and making their home a place of warmth and welcome. In the spring of 1879, Emma discovered she was expecting their first child. Frank's response to the news was to build in addition to their cabin 2 new rooms to accommodate their growing family. He worked evenings and weekends, his hands crafting not just walls and a roof but a future for the child who would join them. Their daughter, Lillian Hope Zimmerman, was born on a snowy December night, with Mrs. Zachary serving as midwife and Frank pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. When he was finally allowed to enter and see his wife cradling their newborn, Frank wept unashamedly, overwhelmed by the miracle they had created together. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully taking his daughter in his arms, "just like her mother." Emma watched them through tired but happy eyes, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "She has your eyes," she observed, noting the clear gray gaze that stared up at Frank with what seemed like recognition. Frank sat carefully on the edge of the bed, cradling Lillian in one arm while reaching for Emma's hand with the other. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything, for saying yes that day, for loving me, for giving us this precious gift." Emma squeezed his hand. "Thank you for giving me a reason to live again when I thought all hope was gone." As Lillian grew, so did the Zimmerman family's dreams. Frank continued working at the Circle Z, earning the respect and friendship of everyone on the ranch while setting aside money toward his goal of someday having his own horse breeding operation. Emma's reputation as a teacher flourished, with parents from as far as 20 miles away asking if their children might board at the ranch during the school term to benefit from her instruction. In 1881, Mr. Zachary approached Frank with an unexpected proposition. The older man had been impressed by Frank's work ethic and vision, and he offered to sell Frank a parcel of the Circle Z land 200 acres with good water access and excellent grazing on favorable terms. "You've been talking about breeding those Morgans for years," Mr. Zachary said. "Time you got started before you're too old to enjoy it." It was an opportunity beyond their wildest expectations. The land adjoined Emma's original homestead, effectively expanding their property into a viable ranch. With careful planning and some help from the bank in Willow Creek, they were able to make the purchase and begin building corrals and a small barn. Frank named their new venture the Double Z Ranch, in honor of both his own name and the Circle Z that had been his home for so many years. Emma surprised him by presenting him with a hand-carved wooden sign for the ranch entrance, having secretly learned the skill from the ranch carpenter. "Now who's the one with hidden talents?" Frank teased, hanging the sign with pride. By the time their son, Thomas Henry Zimmerman, joined the family in the summer of 1883, the Double Z was becoming known throughout the territory for its quality Morgan horses. Frank's natural affinity for horseflesh, combined with Emma's meticulous record-keeping and business sense, made them a formidable team in the competitive world of horse breeding. The cabin had grown again to accommodate their expanding family, with Frank adding a proper dining room and a larger kitchen where Emma could teach both children the cooking skills her mother had passed down to her. The original table, the one where she had sat crying over 2 plates on that fateful day, still held pride of place in the new dining room, a reminder of how far they had come. As the children grew, they became integral to life on the ranch. Lillian, with her father's quiet determination and her mother's love of learning, showed a remarkable aptitude for working with the horses. Thomas, a more boisterous child with a ready laugh, preferred helping Emma in the garden and kitchen but was equally at home on horseback by the time he was 5. Emma continued to teach at the ranch school until 1885, when the town of Willow Creek built its first proper schoolhouse and invited her to become the head teacher. Though she missed the intimacy of the small ranch school, the position allowed her to be home more with her children while still pursuing her passion for education. Frank's business flourished, with Double Z Morgans becoming sought after throughout Arizona Territory and beyond. He hired 2 full-time hands to help with the expanding operation, building a bunkhouse for them near the main barn. The Zimmerman homestead became a gathering place for friends and neighbors, with Emma's hospitality as renowned as Frank's horses. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1888, Frank presented Emma with a surprise: the deed to a small piece of land at the highest point of their property, where a grove of cottonwoods surrounded a natural spring. For what? Emma asked, puzzled by the specific gift. Frank led her to the site, where foundation stones had already been laid. For our new home, he explained. A proper house with a view of everything we've built together. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she surveyed the location, which indeed offered a panoramic view of their ranch, from the pastures where the horses grazed to the original homestead cabin where they had begun their life together. What about the cabin? She asked, thinking of all the memories it contained. Frank smiled, understanding her concern. It will always be part of our ranch. I thought perhaps Lillian and Thomas might use it as a place to play, or we could offer it to guests. But it's time we had a home that truly reflects who we've become together. The house took a year to build, with Frank overseeing every detail when he wasn't tending to the horses. It was a spacious 2-story structure with wide porches, large windows to catch the light and the views, and enough bedrooms for their family plus guests. Emma's touch was evident in the practical kitchen, the built-in bookshelves in the parlor, and the garden she began planning even before the walls were finished. On a warm October evening in 1889, almost exactly 11 years after they had first sat down to a meal together at that small table with 2 plates, Frank and Emma Zimmerman moved into their new home. That night, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, Frank and Emma stood on the back porch, looking out over their land in the moonlight. "Did you ever imagine, that day you came to deliver my supplies, that we would end up here?" Emma asked, leaning into the circle of Frank's arm. Frank was quiet for a moment, his gaze taking in the ranch that had grown from a small homestead to a thriving enterprise, the home they had built together, and finally coming to rest on the face of the woman who had brought such unexpected joy into his life. "No," he admitted. "I just knew that I couldn't bear to see you in such pain. All I wanted in that moment was to offer some small comfort." Emma reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that 11 years of sun and wind and laughter had etched there. "You gave me so much more than comfort, Frank. You gave me a reason to live again, to love again. You helped me see that grief isn't the end of the story." Frank turned his head to kiss her palm. "And you gave me a home, Emma. Not just a place, but a belonging. You and the children, you're everything I never knew I needed until I found you." As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, Emma thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a grieving widow and a solitary cowboy to partners in life, love, and enterprise. The path hadn't always been smooth, but every step had led them here, to a happiness deeper and more enduring than either could have imagined on that day when 2 plates sat on a table and tears fell freely. "Do you know what day it is?" Emma asked softly. Frank nodded. 11 years to the day since I first came to your door," Emma smiled up at him. "And I'm still glad you knocked." Frank's arms tightened around her. "So am I, my love, so am I." Inside their new home, the future waited with all its promise and possibility. Outside, the land they had nurtured together stretched in all directions, a testament to what could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. And between them, in the space where 2 hearts had found each other across grief and time, there was only gratitude for the journey that had brought them home.